Kunta Kinte was born in the village of Jufura, nestled along the Gambia River in West Africa, a place where the rhythm of life was measured by the rising and setting of the sun and the echo of drums that told the stories of generations long before him. His family belonged to the Mandinka people, a proud community with deep traditions, a strong code of honor, and an unbroken connection to their ancestors. From the earliest days of his life, Kunta was taught the customs, the songs, the dances, and the spiritual beliefs that formed the backbone of his identity. Each morning, as the sun painted the sky with shades of gold and orange, he would rise with the village, helping his parents and learning from the elders who had seen decades, even lifetimes, of wisdom unfold along the river banks. He learned the names of the animals, the plants, the stars, and the winds that whispered secrets through the trees. He learned the stories of warriors, hunters, and kings who had shaped the Mandinka people. And he learned that to be a man was to honor those who came before you, to respect the laws of your people, and to carry your identity with pride. From the beginning, Kunta's life was intertwined with the rhythms of survival and the joy of community. The village thrived on agriculture, trade, and storytelling. Children like Kunta were trained early to handle responsibility, not through fear but through a sense of belonging. He spent hours learning the skills that would one day mark him as a man: a strong arm for carrying burdens, a sharp eye for hunting, a quick mind for strategy. He practiced with other boys under the watchful eyes of the elders, learning to respect authority while also cultivating courage and independence. Even in play, lessons were embedded. Games became training grounds for strength, speed, and strategy. The songs they sang were not merely entertainment. They encoded histories, values, and the wisdom of ancestors who had survived countless trials and migrations. Kunta's mother, Binta, played a crucial role in shaping his early understanding of the world. She would sit with him under the shade of a baobab tree and tell him stories of the spirits of the rivers and of the mighty Mandinka warriors who had defended their lands for generations. Her words painted a picture of a world that was rich, ordered, and interconnected. "Remember who you are, Kunta," she would say, "for your name is your soul. Guard it with your life, and it will guide you through any storm." These words became a mantra that he would carry for the rest of his life, though he could not have known how. Literally, he would one day need to hold on to them. His father, Omoro, ensured that Kunta understood the importance of discipline and skill. He taught him to handle tools, to hunt small animals, and to navigate the river currents with precision. From an early age, Kunta was instilled with the knowledge that a man's honor is measured by his courage, loyalty, and the ability to protect his family and community. As he grew older, Kunta became known among his peers not only for his physical strength, but also for his keen mind and curiosity. He asked questions about everything: the reasons behind the elders' rules, the origins of their customs, the deeper meanings of the stories told during the moonlit gatherings. He was not a boy content to simply accept life as it came. He wanted to understand it, to master it, to know where he came from and what his responsibilities were in the larger circle of life. This curiosity made him both admired and respected by his peers, and it made the elders hopeful for the future of their community, for they saw in him the potential to become a strong and wise leader one day. The village of Jufur itself was a place of remarkable beauty and culture. Houses made of clay and thatch lined the pathways, and children ran barefoot through fields of millet and sorghum, their laughter echoing off the river banks. Women worked skillfully in the gardens, tending to the crops with hands that knew the rhythm of the soil, while men constructed tools, prepared the village for trade, and trained the next generation of hunters and protectors. The community was tightly knit, and every member played a role in maintaining balance and harmony. Kunta learned from a young age that his actions had consequences not only for himself, but for the entire village. Responsibility, honor, and interdependence were not abstract concepts. They were daily practices, lived and reinforced through example and repetition. Religion and spirituality were central to Kunta's upbringing. The Mandinka people believed in a supreme creator, ancestral spirits, and the interconnectedness of all living things. Every action had meaning, every ritual had purpose, and every story carried lessons that connected the present to the past. Kunta participated in ceremonies that marked the changing seasons, the rites of passage for children and adolescents, and the rituals that honored ancestors. Music, dance, and storytelling were inseparable from these spiritual practices. They were not mere entertainment, they were vessels of memory, culture, and survival. Kunta learned the sacred songs of his people, the incantations used to call upon protection, and the dances that celebrated life, growth, and community. He internalized these practices, carrying them in his memory as if they were armor for his soul. By the time Kunta reached his teenage years, he had become a skilled young man, physically strong, intellectually curious, and deeply connected to the spiritual and cultural life of his community. He was proud of who he was and the life he had been given. Every morning he would walk along the river, feeling the earth beneath his feet, the wind against his skin, and the river's pulse in his chest. He would listen to the stories carried on the breeze, the songs of the elders, and the laughter of children. He understood the importance of memory, of knowing where he came from, and of honoring the lives that had preceded him. Every lesson, every story, every ritual was a piece of a tapestry that defined him, shaped him, and prepared him for the responsibilities that lay ahead. Kunta's life in Jafure was not without challenges. As a young man, he was expected to contribute to the defense of the village, participate in communal labor, and prepare for the possibility of conflict with neighboring communities. He trained rigorously with other young men, learning to wield weapons, read the land, and anticipate danger. He was taught that strength alone was not enough. Wisdom, strategy, and courage were equally essential. Failure was not tolerated lightly, for the well-being of the entire community could depend on the actions of individuals. Kunta internalized these lessons deeply, understanding that honor was earned through discipline, respect, and the protection of others. In addition to physical and spiritual training, Kunta learned the art of storytelling. Elders would gather the children and young men under the shade of trees, recounting tales of heroes, warriors, and ancestors who had shaped the Mandinka people. These stories were rich with moral lessons, strategy, and cultural knowledge. Kunta absorbed every word, understanding that the past was not separate from the present, that remembering who they were and where they came from was essential to surviving and thriving in the world. He memorized proverbs, songs, and chants, knowing that one day these would serve as a guide and a shield in times of trial. Kunta's upbringing instilled in him a profound sense of self-worth. He knew his name was more than a label. It was a declaration of identity, a connection to his ancestors, and a marker of his place in the world. His name was sacred, tied to his family, his village, and his people. Every lesson from his parents, every story from the elders, every ritual he participated in reinforced the value of self-knowledge and the importance of never allowing that identity to be stolen. This foundation would prove crucial in the years to come, for Kunta's knowledge of who he was would become the most powerful weapon he possessed against the forces determined to erase him. Kunta's daily life was a balance of work, learning, play, and spiritual practice. He helped his parents with farming, collected firewood, and tended to the needs of his household, all while continuing his studies under the guidance of village elders. He practiced hunting, learned the rhythms of the river, and honed his physical and mental abilities. Yet even in these mundane tasks, there was a profound sense of purpose. Every action was a lesson in resilience, every mistake an opportunity to grow. Kunta internalized the interconnectedness of life, understanding that survival, honor, and identity were inseparable from the world around him. Perhaps most importantly, Kunta's early life was filled with joy, laughter, and the kind of freedom that comes from being fully rooted in a place that is yours. He ran through the fields with friends, swam in the river, and climbed the trees like a boy with the sun on his back. He sang songs that echoed across the village, danced in circles during festivals, and participated in games that taught strategy and skill. Every day was an affirmation of life, culture, and belonging. This foundation of joy, pride, and identity would later serve as a lifeline when he faced the unimaginable horrors that awaited him across the Atlantic. As Kunta approached adulthood, he was on the cusp of taking his place as a full member of his community. He understood his responsibilities, his rights, and his place in the ongoing story of his people. He was strong, capable, knowledgeable, and deeply rooted in the traditions of Jafure. He believed in the continuity of life, the power of memory, and the strength of identity. Little did he know that the life he knew, one filled with freedom, culture, family, and community, was about to be violently ripped away from him. The world he had grown up in, the land he had walked, the songs he had sung, and the people he loved were all about to be threatened by forces that sought to erase everything he held dear. And yet, even on the cusp of the unimaginable, Kunta Kinte carried within him the unshakable core of who he was. Every story his mother told him, every lesson from his father, every chant, every ritual, every laugh, every song, these became the armor that would protect him. They would be the anchors he clung to through the horrors of capture, the Middle Passage, and a life of bondage in a foreign land. For Kunta Kinte, identity was not a luxury, it was survival. And that survival, rooted in the rich, unbroken traditions of Jufuur, would define the rest of his life and echo through the generations that followed him. The day Kunta Kinte was captured remains one of the darkest turning points in his life. A day when the drums of Jufuur fell silent and the future he had imagined disappeared like smoke in the wind. He was 17 years old, strong, alert, and full of youthful confidence. The sun had barely risen, painting the sky in pale gold, and the village was alive with its usual rhythm. Children laughed as they ran barefoot through the paths. Women carried water from the river, and men sharpened their tools and tended to the crops. Kunta was sent to gather firewood from the forest near the edge of the village, a routine task he had done countless times. But this morning, something felt different. The air seemed heavy, the birds strangely quiet, as though nature itself sensed the danger that lurked in the shadows. As he moved deeper into the forest, the first sign of trouble came in the distant sound of footsteps that were not familiar. They were deliberate, rhythmic, and heavier than the feet of villagers. Kunta paused, his senses sharpening. He had been trained to notice such things, to anticipate threats from predators and from rival villages. But nothing could have prepared him for the terror he was about to face. From behind a thick line of trees, men armed with sticks, ropes, and knives leapt out, shouting in a language Kunta did not fully understand. They were strangers, foreign yet familiar in their cruelty. Before he could react, hands grabbed his arms, yanking him to the ground, and he struggled with every ounce of strength in his body. But there were too many of them. Despite his youth, speed, and skill, he was overpowered, bound, and forced into a world he had never imagined. Kunta's first moments of captivity were a chaotic blur of fear, anger, and confusion. The men dragged him across the forest floor, ignoring his cries, striking him when he resisted, and shouting orders to each other. He tried to run, tried to strike, tried to bite and twist free, but their numbers were overwhelming. His body, honed by years of running and training, became a tool of resistance, but it was no match for ropes, iron chains, and sheer brutality. With each step, he realized that he was being taken far from the land he knew, the people he loved, and the home that had raised him. The river, the fields, the baobab trees, and the laughter of his friends and family were fading behind him, replaced by fear, darkness, and the unknown. He was brought first to a holding area near the coast, a place designed to hold captives before they were shipped across the Atlantic. The compound was crowded, filled with men, women, and children who had been captured from other villages. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, fear, and illness. People huddled together, weeping quietly, rocking themselves back and forth, murmuring prayers and comforting their children. Kunta's heart pounded as he tried to comprehend the scale of what had happened. He was not alone, yet the presence of so many others in chains did little to ease his fear. In fact, it amplified it. He realized that this was not an isolated incident. This was a systematic, organized assault on his people, his culture, and his life. The captors spoke to each other in foreign tongues, treating humans like animals, measuring them, marking them, and dividing them as though they were nothing more than property. Days passed in this holding compound, each one a test of endurance. Kunta was given little food and even less water. He was forced to stand or sit in the same position for hours at a time, watched by armed guards who punished anyone who resisted. He observed the other captives, some resigned, some defiant, and some broken entirely. Children cried for their parents, women wept for their husbands, and men plotted escape only to be caught and beaten. Kunta tried to comfort those around him with words, gestures, and songs from Jufuur, reminding them of their identities, their courage, and the ancestors who had fought to protect them. But his heart ached because he knew that comfort could only go so far. The shadow of what awaited them, the journey across the ocean, loomed over everyone in the compound, a darkness that seemed to stretch infinitely. The slavers worked with efficiency and calculation. They kept Kunta and the others in this holding area, inspecting them for strength, health, and potential resistance. They shaved heads, tied hands, and separated families. Kunta watched in horror as men and women were torn from each other, some never to see one another again. His own attempts at defiance, refusing to eat the meager rations, refusing to kneel, refusing to let them rename him, were met with punishment. They whipped him, beat him, and chained him in ways that tested the limits of human endurance. Yet in the midst of pain, Kunta clung to the teachings of his elders, the stories of his mother, and the sacred knowledge that his name, his identity, and his spirit could not be stolen. He repeated the words of his mother silently. Like a mantra, "Your name is your soul. Guard it with your life." These words became his shield. When the day finally came to load the captives onto the ship, Kunta faced a terror unlike anything he had experienced. The Atlantic slave ships were designed to maximize profit at the expense of human life, and the captives were treated as commodities rather than people. Kunta was forced into the hold, a dark, suffocating space where he could barely move, stacked against others in conditions that defied imagination. The smell of the hold was unbearable. Sweat, vomit, human waste, and fear combined into a thick, choking stench. Kunta pressed his face into the folds of another captive's clothing, trying to breathe, trying to stay calm, trying to survive. Around him, people whispered prayers, wept quietly, and hummed songs from home, desperate to retain their humanity. Kunta joined in these songs silently, keeping the rhythms of Jafura alive in his mind and soul, even as the world above held only darkness. The Middle Passage was a nightmare that seemed endless. Storms tossed the ship violently, the cries of the dying filled the hold, and sickness swept through the captives like fire. Kunta witnessed horrors that would haunt him for the rest of his life: children convulsing from fever, women clutching their dead infants, men beaten to death for resisting, and the relentless despair that threatened to crush every human spirit in the hold. He was not immune to fear. The panic, the smell, the dark, and the constant threat of death pressed upon him like iron chains heavier than any rope. Yet even in the face of such unimaginable suffering, he refused to let go of who he was. He repeated his name silently, over and over: Kunta Kinte. Not Toby, not a number, not a commodity. Kunta Kinte. His identity was a lifeline, a reminder that they could take his body but not his soul. During the weeks at sea, Kunta observed the behaviors of both the capti, Ves, and the slavers. He learned quickly which rules to follow to avoid immediate death, and which moments allowed subtle defiance, whispering, gesturing, or sharing secret foods. He memorized the patterns of the sailors, the timing of meals, the hours when supervision was lax, and the ways to survive without surrendering his spirit. His intelligence, his courage, and his discipline, all learned in the village of Jufure, became tools for endurance. In these moments he was not just surviving, he was resisting, refusing to be erased mentally even as his body was imprisoned. Kunta also mourned deeply for his village, his family, and his community. Every night he imagined the riverbanks, the trees, the songs, and the laughter he had known. He felt the absence of his ancestors' guidance acutely, but he also drew strength from it. He remembered the stories of past warriors who had survived invasions, who had resisted conquest, and who had preserved their culture against impossible odds. He told himself that he was carrying their legacy across the ocean, that even if the captors thought they had succeeded in breaking him, they could not erase the memories etched in his soul. These memories became as vital as food and water, sustaining him through the darkest nights. By the time the ship reached the coast of America, Kunta was physically weakened but spiritually unbroken. The sight of the land he had never seen before was both terrifying and surreal. He knew that what awaited him was not freedom, not safety, not justice. He would be sold into a plantation system designed to strip him of his identity, his dignity, and his humanity. Yet as he stepped onto the soil of a foreign land, he carried the unshakable knowledge of who he was: Kunta Kinte, a son of Jufure, a Mandinka warrior, a keeper of memory, and a human being who refused to be reduced to property, even in the first moments of captivity on American soil. Kunta made a promise to himself: he would never abandon his name, his culture, or the lessons of his village. No matter what they did, he would hold on to the truth of who he was, and that determination, rooted in years of discipline, training, spiritual grounding, and the unwavering love of his family, would define the rest of his life. It was the seed of resistance, a spark that would survive the cruelties of slavery and eventually illuminate the story of all those who had been silenced. The capture of Kunta Kinte was not only a personal tragedy, it was emblematic of the larger theft of identity and humanity that defined the transatlantic slave trade. Yet his survival, his memory, and his unbroken spirit became the foundation for resistance, storytelling, and the preservation of culture for generations to come. Though the drums of Jufure fell silent the day he was taken, the beat continued in his heart. Every whisper of the wind, every memory, every prayer, and every song carried the pulse of a village stolen but never forgotten. Kunta Kinte's journey to America had begun, but his fight to remain Kunta Kinte, the boy from Jufura who refused to bow, had only just started. The middle passage was a horror that defied human comprehension, a journey designed to crush not only bodies but spirits, and Kunta Kinte endured it with the memory of Jofura burning like a flame inside him. From the moment he was forced aboard the ship, he understood that this voyage was unlike anything he had experienced. The air in the hold was thick, suffocating, and rank with the combined odors of sweat, vomit, and human waste. The cries of men, women, and children filled every corner of the cramped space, a constant reminder that the sea itself had become a prison. Kunta's body, though strong from years of training in the village, was battered by the chain that bound him and the unrelenting weight of hundreds of bodies pressed against his own. There was no privacy, no relief, and almost no light. He could barely see the faces around him, but he could feel their fear, their despair, and their anger vibrating through the thin wooden walls of the ship. The sailors showed no mercy. Every attempt at resistance was met with brutality. If a captive refused to eat, they were whipped. If they spoke their native language, they were bound even tighter. Kunta was forced to endure these punishments again and again, his body bruised and bleeding, yet his mind remained sharp and his spirit unbroken. He understood that to survive this ordeal, he had to learn the patterns of his captors, anticipate their moves, and find small ways to preserve his autonomy even within the confines of the ship. Every day was a battle between submission and resistance, between despair and the flickering light of hope that he clung to as if it were a life raft. In the darkness of the hold, Kunta witnessed the depths of human suffering. Children cried endlessly, some wailing for parents who had already been torn from them. Women moaned for husbands or siblings, their bodies trembling from both cold and fear. Men fought desperately to maintain a sense of dignity, sometimes violently, sometimes silently, as they sought to resist the overwhelming oppression. Many did not survive the voyage, falling ill or succumbing to starvation and abuse. The dead were cast into the sea without ceremony, their absence marked only by the silence left behind in the overcrowded hold. Kunta watched all of this and felt grief and rage in equal measure, emotions that threatened to overwhelm him, yet also reminded him why survival was necessary. Every breath he drew was an act of defiance, every heartbeat a refusal to be erased. Despite the horrific conditions, Kunta refused to surrender his identity. His name, his language, and the teachings of his village remained as vital as air or water. He whispered stories of Jofura to himself, recalling the songs, the dances, the proverbs, and the lessons of the elders. He recalled the sound of the river, the smell of the earth, and the faces of his parents and friends. These memories were more than comfort, they were a weapon against the psychological assault of slavery. He would repeat his name in his mind over and over, Kunta Kinte, not Toby, not a number. Kunta Kinte. This act, small as it may seem, was a profound form of resistance. While the captors sought to strip him of everything that defined him, he clung to the essence of who he was, nurturing it carefully so that it could survive both the voyage and the years of captivity that awaited him. The days aboard the ship blurred together. Sunlight rarely reached the hold, and time became an abstract concept measured only by the rhythms of the sailors and the sounds of the waves crashing against the hull. Storms battered the ship, tossing it violently and causing panic among both the captives and the crew. Kunta learned to anchor himself mentally, using the sounds and sensations around him to maintain a sense of order within the chaos. He observed the guards and sailors closely, noting when they were distracted or when routines could be anticipated. These small observations were critical, allowing him to avoid unnecessary beatings and to maintain as much control over his immediate environment as possible. During the voyage, Kunta also witnessed moments of quiet humanity and solidarity among the captives. In the darkness, some would share scraps of food, comfort one another with whispered words, or teach small songs from home. Kunta participated in these exchanges whenever possible, understanding that maintaining human connection was essential to survival. He reminded others of their names, their villages, and their families. He encouraged them to hold on to their memories, for these were the only things the slavers could not steal. In these moments, Kunta became more than a captive. He became a leader and a symbol of resilience, quietly inspiring others to preserve their identities in the face of unimaginable cruelty. The physical toll of the journey was immense. Disease spread rapidly through the confined space, and Kunta watched helplessly as friends and strangers alike succumbed to fevers, dysentery, and other illnesses. The stench and filth of the hold seemed inescapable, and injuries went untreated. Kunta endured beatings for minor infractions, sometimes inflicted simply for being alive. He learned to endure the pain, to breathe through it, and to remind himself that survival required both strength of body and strength of mind. Every moment of suffering became a test of endurance, every insult or punishment an opportunity to practice the discipline he had learned in Jufure. He reminded himself that giving in to despair would mean surrendering not only his body but also the soul he had spent years cultivating in his homeland. Kunta's spiritual life became a lifeline during the voyage. He prayed silently to his ancestors, invoking the protection and guidance of those who had gone before him. He recited the chants and incantations his mother had taught him, even when fear threatened to silence his voice. These prayers were not only acts of devotion but also a way to maintain a connection to home and to assert the existence of something beyond the immediate horrors surrounding him. In his mind, Jufure was never entirely lost. The river still flowed, the trees still swayed, and the elders' voices still guided him. These mental images provided strength, hope, and a sense of continuity in a world that sug to erase all continuity. Kunta also began to notice the subtle psychological strategies the sailors used to control the captives. They sought to break spirits by separating families, renaming individuals, and enforcing strict, often arbitrary rules. They punished collective disobedience with brutality designed to instill fear. Kunta recognized that compliance often meant survival, yet he refused to surrender his mind completely. He learned to navigate this delicate balance, performing the minimal actions required to avoid death while preserving the core of his identity internally. This duality, outward compliance coupled with inward defiance, was a critical survival tactic that allowed him to endure a journey that claimed the lives of many others. The constant threat of death and the brutal conditions created a unique psychological environment. Some captives became silent, numbed by fear and exhaustion. Others lashed out, sometimes violently, in moments of despair. Kunta observed all of this with keen awareness, learning both the strengths and weaknesses of the human spirit under extreme oppression. He understood that survival required patience, observation, and strategic resistance. The ability to endure, to maintain one's humanity, and to preserve memory became acts of rebellion in themselves. Kunta's mind, disciplined and trained in the ways of his village, became a sanctuary that the sailors could never invade, a mental fortress built on the lessons of home. As the weeks passed, the ship approached the coast of the Americas. The anticipation of arrival was mingled with dread. Kunta knew that landing in a foreign land meant the beginning of another ordeal, the plantations, the forced labor, and the constant threat of violence that awaited him. Yet even as fear surged, he held onto the knowledge that he carried with him the essence of Jufure. He knew that his entity, preserved through song, story, prayer, and memory, was a weapon more powerful than any whip or chain. The name Kunta Kinte was more than a name. It was a promise to himself and to the generations that would follow that Africa and its people could not be erased. When the ship finally docked, the sight of the unfamiliar coastline and the foreign language of the overseers struck a new chord of fear into Kunta's heart. He was sold almost immediately upon arrival, a transaction that treated human beings as property without regard for the lives or identities contained within them. Yet even in that moment, as he was forced from the ship onto alien soil, he repeated his mantra silently, Kunta Kinte, not Toby, not slave number, Kunta Kinte. This act of defiance, invisible to the captors, was the first step in a lifelong struggle to maintain identity, resist dehumanization, and preserve the memory of home. Kunta's journey across the Middle Passage was more than a physical displacement. It was an attempt to strip him of his history, his culture, and his humanity. Yet in the darkness of the hold, amidst suffering and death, he preserved the lessons of Jufure, the names of ancestors, and the stories that had shaped him. He clung to his language, his faith, and his identity as tightly as he clung to life itself. Every song, every whispered prayer, every memory was an act of rebellion, a refusal to be erased, and a defiance against a world that sought to reduce him to nothing. By the time Kunta Kinte stepped onto American soil, he was physically battered, emotionally scarred, and forever changed by the horrors of the Atlantic crossing. Yet his mind remained unbroken, his spirit intact, and his identity preserved. He had survived the most brutal journey imaginable, carrying within him the essence of his homeland and the unshakable conviction that he would never forget which he was. This was the first act of resistance in a life defined by defiance. Kunta Kinte had survived the Middle Passage, and in doing so, he had preserved the most powerful weapon a human being could possess, the truth of his own identity. The moment Kunta Kinte stepped onto the soil of America, he knew that the horrors of the Middle Passage were only the beginning. He was sold at a Virginia plantation, a vast expanse of land where tobacco fields stretched endlessly under the sun, and where human lives were reduced to labor, profit, and obedience. The plantation was run with a cruelty that combined meticulous organization with unchecked violence. Overseers wielded whips as easily as they gave orders, and the masters of the estate treated their human property as tools rather than living beings. Every step Kunta took in this new world reminded him that he was no longer free, that the rhythms of Jafur were replaced by the commands of strangers, and that survival would now require cunning, endurance, and unbroken spirit. The first days on the plantation were marked by confusion and pain. Kunta was forced to work long hours in the fields, his body still recovering from the ordeal of the Middle Passage. The labor was backbreaking, clearing land, planting crops, tending tobacco, carrying heavy loads under the relentless sun, and obeying the orders of overseers who punished any hesitation with immediate violence. Every movement was scrutinized, every misstep punished, every complaint met with cruelty. Yet even in the midst of such brutality, Kunta refused to surrender his identity. When the overseers tried to strip him of his name and called him Toby, he resisted silently, refusing to respond, refusing to accept it as his own. That single act of defiance, invisible to many but potent in its significance, became the foundation of his resistance on the plantation. Kunta Q. Uwikli learned that survival required both adaptation and vigilance. He observed the behaviors of the overseers, noting when punishment was likely and when compliance could buy a moment of reprieve. He learned to perform the minimum tasks necessary to avoid immediate harm, while reserving his energy, his mind, and his spirit for acts of quiet defiance. At the same time, he maintained his connection to Africa through memory, song, and prayer. He whispered the Mandinka words of his parents under his breath, recited the proverbs of his village, and sang the songs that reminded him of home. These acts, though subtle, were revolutionary in a system designed to erase identity. They allowed him to endure the physical and psychological violence of slavery, while preserving the core of who he was. The plantation itself was a microcosm of oppression. Families were separated, children were taken from parents, and marriages were not recognized. Kunta watched as men, women, and children endured beatings, forced labor, and dehumanizing treatment. The whips left scars, but the psychological wounds ran deeper, threatening to erase language, memory, and culture. Kunta understood that resistance would take many forms. Some would resist physically, some mentally, and some spiritually. He chose to resist mentally and spiritually, cultivating an inner world where he remained Kunta Kinte, a son of Jafur, a Mandinka warrior, and a human being unbroken by circumstance. Despite the brutality, Kunta attempted to escape, driven by the hope of returning to the land he loved and the freedom he had lost. His first attempt ended in capture and severe punishment. The overseers were ruthless. They chained him, whipped him, and sent a message to others about the consequences of defiance. Yet even this failure did not break him. He continued to resist in small ways, speaking Mandinka in secret, teaching others the songs and stories of Africa, and refusing to accept the name Toby in any part of himself. Every act of mental defiance, no matter how small, was a victory against the system that sought to dehumanize him. He learned that survival was not just physical, it was a battle for the mind, the memory, and the soul. Kunta's connection to Africa became both a source of strength and a source of pain. Every memory of Jafur reminded him of what he had lost, the freedom of his village, the faces of his family, the rivers and forests of his homeland. At night, lying on the hard floor of the cabin or beneath the open sky, he would close his eyes and imagine the sun rising over his village, the drum beats calling the community together, the laughter of children, and the wise words of elders. These visions sustained him, but they also brought grief, for he knew he might never see these things again. Yet even in grief, there was resilience. By remembering, Kunta preserved what slavery sought to erase. His mind became a sanctuary where Africa remained alive, untainted by the chains that bound his body. Kunta's resistance also inspired those around him. Other captives observed his refusal to bow completely, his insistence on maintaining his name, and his quiet acts of defiance. Some began to imitate his methods, whispering Mandinka words to one another, recalling stories from their own villages, or finding subtle ways to resist the authority of the overseers. In this way, Kunta became a symbol of resilience on the plantation. He showed that even under extreme oppression, identity and culture could survive. The very act of remembering and passing on African traditions became a form of rebellion, a statement that the captors could never fully erase the human spirit. Kunta's struggle was not only against physical oppression but also against psychological warfare. The plantation system relied on breaking individuals into obedient laborers by destroying their sense of self. Names were changed, languages forbidden, and punishments inflicted for acts of defiance. Kunta resisted by cultivating mental fortitude, focusing on the knowledge that his name, his language, and his memories could not be taken by force. This mental resistance was a daily act of courage. He memorized African songs, recited prayers, and kept alive the stories of his people. In doing so, he created a private space of freedom within the confines of captivity. Kunta also endured repeated attempts to erase his identity through violence and intimidation. Whippings left permanent scars, but the marks on his body were less important than the preservation of his mind and spirit. He refused to answer to the name Toby, despite beatings and threats. He refused to fully assimilate into the forced culture imposed upon him. Every refusal, every act of memory was a declaration that he remained Kunta Kinte, not an anonymous laborer. His inner life became a battleground, where the forces of oppression clashed with the power of memory, culture, and identity. Through this struggle, Kunta maintained his sense of self, even as his captors tried to reduce him to property. The plantation was a place where time seemed to stretch endlessly, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun, the rhythm of the labor, and the constant threat of punishment. Yet in this oppressive monotony, Kunta found moments of spiritual and emotional sustenance. He formed small alliances with other captives, sharing knowledge, stories, and traditions. He taught them to whisper songs in the Mandinka language, to remember their names, and to keep alive the essence of their homelands. In these small acts, Kunta nurtured hope. He understood that while the captors could control their bodies, they could not fully conquer their minds if they continued to remember, resist, and teach. His role became that of a guardian of culture, passing on the traditions of Africa to ensure that they would survive even in the most hostile environment. Kunta's determination to maintain his identity carried a heavy emotional weight. He was constantly reminded of what he had lost: the laughter of his family, the embrace of his parents, the freedom of his village. Each memory was a double-edged sword, offering comfort and hope while also intensifying the pain of separation. Yet he never allowed grief to paralyze him. Instead, he transformed it into resolve, a quiet determination to survive, to preserve his culture, and to resist assimilation. He carried Jafur within him, and in doing so, he carried a piece of Africa across the ocean and into the hearts of all who would come after him. Even as Kunta endured the relentless labor, punishment, and psychological warfare of the plantation, he remained vigilant for opportunities to assert his freedom. He attempted escape, though each attempt was dangerous and often met with severe punishment. These acts, whether successful or not, demonstrated that his spirit had not been broken. Kunta's refusal to accept subjugation in its entirety, to hold on to his name, and to maintain his culture became a model for others. It showed that slavery, no matter how violent or oppressive, could not fully destroy the human spirit when there was determination, memory, and identity to preserve. Kunta Kinte's life on the plantation was a constant negotiation between survival and resistance. Each day required physical endurance, mental discipline, and spiritual resilience. He learned to navigate the dangerous landscape of slavery, performing required tasks while preserving his inner world. The lessons of Jafur, courage, honor, and identity became tools for survival. They guided him through the most brutal treatment and reminded him that he was more than a slave. He was a human being with a history, a name, and a soul. By maintaining this perspective, Kunta ensured that the essence of who he was would endure beyond the immediate violence of the plantation. Through all this suffering, Kunta Kinte became a living testament to the strength of African culture, memory, and identity. He demonstrated that even under extreme oppression, one could resist mentally, spiritually, and culturally. His refusal to abandon his name, to forget his homeland, and to surrender his identity became an act of rebellion that transcended the brutality of slavery. Kunta's story was not only his own, it became a symbol for all enslaved Africans, a reminder that identity, culture, and memory could survive even when every external freedom was taken. In holding on to who he was, Kunta Kinte defied the system that sought to erase him and paved the way for future generations to reclaim their history and heritage. Kunta Kinte's struggle did not end with survival on the plantation. It continued through the generations that followed, in the legacy of his children, grandchildren, and the countless descendants who inherited the unbroken spirit of a man who refused to be erased. Though the physical chains of slavery bound his body, they could not bind the culture, memory, and identity he carried within him. His determination to remember who he was, to pass that knowledge forward, and to resist dehumanization became a foundation for generations, an inheritance of resilience that could not be stolen. Kunta's story was never just about one man. It was about the survival of a people, the preservation of a culture, and the unrelenting assertion that the human spirit could not be extinguished, no matter how great the oppression. Kunta's daughter, Kizzy, inherited not only the physical strength and resilience of her father, but also his deep-rooted sense of identity. She was raised in the shadow of slavery, but nurtured with the memories and traditions of Africa that Kunta had fought so hard to preserve. Though the overseers sought to indoctrinate her, to teach her to forget her heritage, Kizzy carried the whispers of Jafur in her heart. Her father taught her the language, the songs, and the stories of their people, ensuring that the essence of their homeland would survive even as their bodies were forced into bondage. Kizzy became a living vessel of resistance, a testament to the power of memory and the enduring strength of family ties across generations. Every lesson Kunta imparted to her was an act of rebellion, a way to ensure that their culture would not be erased by the brutality of slavery. Through Kizzy, Kunta's teachings continued to ripple outward, influencing the lives of grandchildren and descendants. The stories he had preserved in his mind became the stories passed down through oral tradition, sung, whispered, and retold in secret, keeping alive the essence of a culture that the system of slavery sought to destroy. These narratives were more than family history. They were acts of defiance, proof that memory could endure even when every physical manifestation of freedom had been stripped away. Kunta's insistence on remembering his name, his homeland, and his identity became a guiding principle for his descendants, teaching them that no external force could completely erase who they were. In this way, Kunta's struggle became immortal, living in the hearts and minds of those who came after him. The discovery of Kunta Kinte's story by Alex Haley in the 20th century brought the power and tragedy of his life to the attention of the wider world. Haley traced his lineage through painstaking research, connecting his own family back to the boy from Jafur who had endured the Middle Passage, resisted the plantation, and preserved his identity against all odds. The publication of Haley's work revealed the deeply personal and human side of slavery, showing the struggles, resistance, and cultural preservation that had long been omitted from history books. Kunta's life was no longer just a family story. It became a symbol for millions of African Americans, a testament to the endurance of culture, identity, and human dignity in the face of systemic oppression. His story exposed the harsh reality of slavery while celebrating the unbreakable human spirit. Kunta Kinte's influence extended beyond the family lineage. It became a cultural touchstone. His story challenged generations to reconsider the narrative of slavery, not as a distant abstraction, but as a lived experience filled with courage, resistance, and humanity. Schools, media, and literature began to reflect the complexity of slavery through personal narratives like his, illustrating the profound impact of cultural memory and the resilience of those who were enslaved. Kunta Kinte's life demonstrated that even when society attempted to erase individuals, the power of identity, story, and heritage could endure. His determination to maintain his name and his memory against unimaginable odds became a beacon for those seeking to reclaim the histories stolen by oppression. The psychological and spiritual lessons of Kunta Kinte's life are as important as the historical facts. He showed that identity is not merely a matter of birth or freedom. It is cultivated, protected, and carried within the mind and heart. Even under the most extreme conditions, he refused to accept the name Toby, refused to abandon the language of his people, and refused to let the trauma of slavery define him completely. These acts of resistance were not just for survival, they were for the preservation of a human legacy. Through his defiance, Kunta Kinte demonstrated that survival without identity is not truly survival, that the mind and spirit can outlast the most violent attempts at dehumanization, and that cultural heritage is a weapon against oppression. The plantation system sought to reduce every enslaved person to a tool for labor, erasing individuality, memory, and culture. Yet Kunta Kinte's story illustrates the failure of this system when confronted with resilience, education, and remembrance. By teaching his daughter Kizzy, resisting the name Toby, and preserving the rituals, songs, and stories of Jufuur, Kunta ensured that the essence of his people would live on. His life underscores a critical lesson: the survival of a culture, even under extreme oppression, depends on the courage and determination of individuals who refuse to let their identity be stolen. Kunta's endurance became a blueprint for cultural preservation and resistance, inspiring others to remember, resist, and pass on knowledge to future generations. Kunta Kinte's story also illuminates the interconnectedness of personal and collective history. His resistance was not only an individual act, it had communal significance. Every song he remembered, every story he told, and every lesson he passed to Kizzy contributed to the continuity of African culture in the Americas. His life exemplifies how individual resilience can influence the survival of entire cultural systems. Even when surrounded by cruelty, he nurtured connections, fostered knowledge transfer, and safeguarded identity. His life demonstrates that history is not merely written in books, it is preserved in memory, in language, in ritual, and in the unyielding determination to remain human in the face of dehumanization. As generations passed, Kunta Kinte's legacy remained alive in the hearts of his descendants. They inherited not only the physical marks of slavery, but also the stories, values, and lessons that had enabled him to resist. His insistence on maintaining his identity, his teachings about pride, and his unbroken spirit became a framework for understanding history, resisting oppression, and reclaiming dignity. The ripple effects of his life reached far beyond his immediate family, influencing broader African American culture, literature, and consciousness. Through this enduring influence, Kunta Kinte's story became a powerful symbol of resilience, resistance, and the triumph of human spirit over systemic oppression. Kunta Kinte's life ultimately reminds us that slavery was not just a system of labor. It was an attempt to erase identities, cultures, and histories. Yet his story also demonstrates that identity, memory, and heritage are indomitable. By holding on to his name, teaching his daughter, and preserving the culture of Jufuur, Kunta defied the logic of oppression. He transformed personal survival into cultural survival, ensuring that African traditions, stories, and values could endure in a land designed to suppress them. His life teaches that the power of memory, the strength of identity, and the will to resist are forces that can withstand even the most violent attempts at eradication. The discovery of Kunta Kinte's lineage in the 20th century and the global attention it received provided a new perspective on the history of slavery. It highlighted the importance of personal narratives, the resilience of culture, and the necessity of remembering those who came before. Kunta's story, once hidden and nearly lost, became a testament to the endurance of the human spirit and the persistence of memory. It forced the world to confront the brutal reality of slavery while celebrating the unbreakable will of those who resisted. His legacy is not just a historical account, it is a lesson in courage, identity, and the power of heritage to transcend generations. In the end, Kunta Kinte's life illustrates a profound truth: the human spirit cannot be fully conquered by oppression. His resistance, his preservation of culture, and his insistence on identity created a legacy that transcended slavery itself. Through his descendants, his teachings, and the stories that survived, Kunta Kinte continues to inspire those who seek to reclaim their histories, honor their ancestors, and preserve the truths of the past. The chains of slavery could not bind him. And though he endured unimaginable suffering, his story became eternal. Kunta Kinte's life is a testament to the resilience of memory, the endurance of culture, and the unbreakable strength of the human soul, proving that identity, once firmly held, can survive even the most oppressive forces. Kunta Kinte's struggle, though deeply personal, became emblematic of the broader struggle of African Americans and enslaved Africans throughout history. It demonstrates that resistance is not always violent or overt, it can be mental, spiritual, and cultural. By refusing to forget, by teaching, and by preserving his heritage, Kunta created a chain of memory that slavery could not destroy. Every descendant, every story told, every song sung in memory of Africa was a continuation of his resistance. His life proves that while slavery sought to destroy, the preservation of culture, identity, and memory ensured that the human spirit could endure, adapt, and ultimately triumph. Through his story, Kunta Kinte reminds us that history is not only a record of oppression and suffering, it is also a record of courage, defiance, and resilience. His life embodies the truth that the human spirit, when rooted in culture, memory, and identity, cannot be conquered. Kunta Kinte is more than a man. He is a symbol, a lesson, and a testament to the enduring power of identity in the face of unimaginable adversity. His legacy survives not in chains or plantations, but in memory, in stories, and in the hearts of all who refuse to forget who they are and where they come from.